H-Podcast into talk. Debrief situation report.
There we go. Good morning, Sir Powell. It's an honor to be with you this morning. My name is Hans Torres. You can call me Hans. This is going to be my first professional interview that I'll be doing, so it's my debut, and I hope you'll be patient with me as well. So please, may you introduce yourself?
Well, good morning, Hans. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm honored to be your first professional interview. I'm Ray Powell. I am the founder and director of SEALIGHT, which is a maritime transparency initiative that got its start out of the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University, and is now transitioning to become a nonprofit organization.
That's amazing, sir. Actually, before we start, how about we start off a bit light? I know you've been into multiple interviews, and I actually would like this to be more of a conversational type, just to lighten the load a bit this morning. So, I've actually read so much about you, and you've had a long and historic military career. You were a U.S. Air Force colonel, and you dabbled in security and defense. But if you weren't in security and defense, what totally different career do you see yourself in? Maybe acting, teaching, cooking? Who knows?
I always did like teaching, so I could imagine myself teaching. I stumbled into military life because I stumbled out of college, which is another way of saying I failed out of college. I was not very disciplined when I was 18, 19 years old. And, I was enrolled in college and wasn't really going to college. So I finally just joined the military because, frankly, I needed some discipline imposed on me from the outside. I guess I don't think too much about what I could have done because I'm just sort of grateful that everything turned out as well as it did, considering how badly I started.
Well, that's amazing. So, Air Force, maybe, what if not the Air Force? What was the next option? Army, Navy,
Well,
Marines?
so actually, that's really interesting. As I was walking into the recruiting center back then in the 80s, there were basically four options: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And I did not visit the Navy because when I had been out on the water in a boat on like a deep sea fishing trip, I got violently ill. And so I didn't want to do that all the time. I did visit the Marine Corps recruiter, and they got me very fired up. They are very good at sort of selling themselves. And then I also did visit the Army, and they actually offered me a bonus that seemed very generous to me. But in the end, I selected the Air Force because to me, it seemed like the more sophisticated service. And even though I was a college dropout, I thought I was a sophisticated college dropout. The way that those things work in a 19-year-old's mind, I guess that's just how it happened.
And from what I've heard, the Air Force has the most money, so it wasn't the hardest decision after all.
Well, they certainly spend money generously on their own people.
Yeah.
The other services give us a hard time because we tend to get the better hotel arrangements often, and so
Yeah. So, actually, reading about you more, your wife is actually Filipina, yeah?
she is. Yeah, she's a Dabueña.
Ooh, all right. So, if by chance that we have any international listeners, what is it like being married to one?
Oh, to a Filipina? Well,
Yeah.
well, let me just say, first of all, I I often will tell my wife that if she ever left me, they would find my emaciated body in a stack of pizza boxes because I can't cook for myself, and she is amazing cook.
Yeah.
She is a foodie.
Mm.
She loves, in fact, wherever I go. So, like right now, I'm in Manila. She's back in California. She always asks me what I ate, and she's always disappointed that I haven't gone out and found better food because I will tend to get whatever's easy instead of whatever's good. And she will always look for the very, very best food. And she's usually disappointed in it because she thinks she can actually make it better. Um, some of the things about being married to a Filipina, one is when we do come back together, which we will do this summer, because she's a school teacher, so she has to wait
Mm.
until school's over. When we come back this summer, we always end up bringing very large balikbayan boxes. And
Yeah.
even when I come by myself, I end up with a really big balikbayan box. That's one of the, so as I get older, I will let her know that, it's not as easy for me to pick those things up anymore. If we get a 50 15-pound balikbayan box, and I have to sort of get it out of the trunk of the cab and, drag it into the airport and all of these things. And then, of course, when I get here, the other thing is she's always looking for ways to save money. And so she will put everything possible into the balikbayan box, and up until the very fill it to the very top, the very maximum weight. And then I have to, once I get here, I have to bring it over to Philippine Airlines Cargo, because that's the cheapest way to send it down to Davao. So so then I have this other trip in front of me. And for anyone who's ever been to the cargo at Philippine Airlines in Manila, it's not a quick visit, right? You have to go through like 7 stages. You have to fill out all of the paperwork. Then you have to go and get it weighed, and then you have to go and then pay your money, and then you have to do all of these things with this big heavy box. So that's one of the features of being married to a Filipina.
So in short, lots of food and lots of things to carry.
Exactly. But
Well,
lots of fun too. So we enjoy life.
yeah, that's amazing. So going into it, your Twitter account is very insightful. You talk about not just the West Philippine Sea, you talk about the Indo-Pacific in the region as well. But that must get really tiring. Like, I can't imagine myself just going through Twitter or going through all these maritime securities and just, I can't even imagine the fatigue you must feel. So when the day ends, how do you mentally switch off, or like, what do you do during your downtime?
Well, so that is one thing. So I will say, one is I don't have a real job, right? So I spent 35 years in the military. They've given me a nice pension, and I'm doing, my wife works, and so this is something that I get to sort of tell myself what I have to do. I don't have a boss. So if I don't want to be sort of out there doing anything at a given time, I don't have to. Although I do feel a little guilty, like if something is happening, like I always sort of want to be the first one who notices something. And so that I put that little extra pressure on myself. And so that does actually, oftentimes, and this I think was most true during sort of the really dramatic events around the resupply missions out at Ayungin Shoal. Those missions would take place during the day in the Philippines, but it was during the evening in California. And so sometimes I would be up very late at night trying to follow these events, and trying to figure out when is it safe to go to sleep, right? When is it really over, and when will people stop contacting me? And so that would be, so I would live blog a lot of the events as I saw them happening. And then eventually I'd go to bed, and I'd wake up in the morning, and then I would read all of the news people who wanted to contact me and ask me for comment. And of course it was like 3 o'clock in the morning and I wasn't awake. So being in California doing some of these things can be a little bit difficult just because the time zones are so different. But for all of that, we've thought about, different times. We've thought about where should we actually live. And I think right now California is the right place for us because of my family situation.
That's good. Well, I hope the time situation gets better and people stop messaging you at 3 a.m. when you're deep in sleep. So all right. So now you talked about your job and all of it. So how about we get into that? A lot of people now are very interested in the West Philippine Sea, but something that escapes a lot of people's minds when we talk about China and the Philippines is our other neighbor to the north, Taiwan. So actually, I think it was on April of this year, AFP Chief General Romeo Browner told the North Luzon Command, and I quote, "Let me give you this further challenge. Do not be content with securing the Northern Hemisphere until Mavulis Island. Start planning for action in case there's an invasion of Taiwan. Inevitably, we will be involved." So given the general geographical proximity and political dynamic, why is it that Taiwan is so important to the Philippines, or in this security concern?
Well, I would say first and foremost because of the geography, right? Taiwan is truly the Philippines, closest neighbor to the north, as you note, and an invasion of Taiwan, a war around Taiwan, would inevitably involve the Philippines at some level. I mean, at the very least, you're talking about all the Filipinos, hundreds of thousands of Filipinos in Taiwan who could instantly become refugees. And how would you handle the refugee flows? Not just Filipinos, but what if you have also other people coming from Taiwan across the Bashi Channel down into Batanes and other places? So I mean, that's just at the very minimum you would have those kinds of things. If let's say an invasion of Taiwan was relatively fast and China didn't encounter much resistance, which is unlikely. I mean, I think any war over Taiwan would be pretty ugly and bloody. But let's say it was fast. Well, all of a sudden, the Philippines would now be looking at China occupying Taiwan and being able to put short-range missiles in at a very, very close range to the northern parts of the Philippines, really complicating the Philippines' strategic situation. So anything that happens in and around Taiwan, is it going to involve the Philippines at some level? And this doesn't even start to talk about what might happen were China to decide, sort of like Japan did in World War II, that the best way to launch an attack would be to take out all of its rivals at the same time and launch simultaneous attacks, say on Japan and the Philippines and the United States, and all at the same time. Now, I ultimately still believe the most likely scenario is that China does not want to invade Taiwan. They want to absorb Taiwan through, just like they want it through the gray zone, through coercion and intimidation and other aggressions, and eventually hope to get a government in Taipei that will give up more and more of Taiwan's sovereignty. So I still think that's the most likely way that China pursues its policy toward Taiwan. But let's say the chances of an invasion of Taiwan are 10%. That's a 10% chance of a cataclysmic event very, very close to the Philippines. And it is entirely appropriate and proper that General Bronner alert his own forces that you absolutely need to be ready for this.
Yeah, and I ask that because a lot of Filipinos, well, whether for good or for bad, they're very protective, but they're protective in a sense that it's my family, it's my area. So if it's my house, I'm gonna defend it, I'm gonna protect it. But if something is happening, all the way out in sea or all the way out in the north, Filipinos can get a bit oblivious to what is actually happening. Like they don't have everything all at once. So when they hear, oh, so China invades Taiwan, who cares? It's not going to affect us, but we don't know that.
Look, Filipinos are no different than anybody else in the world, right? For the most part, people want to be left alone and live their lives, and they don't want to have to think about all of these things. But there's an old saying by a famous Russian communist, Trotsky, that says, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you," right? Yeah. So, you do have to, and that's what makes, I think, the recent events, let's say the last 2 years in the West Philippine Sea, and the government's policy of transparency, I think, one of the things that make it so important. Because transparency, when it comes to aggression by a larger country, forces people to look out and understand the security situation more than they naturally would, right? And so when you show people, for example, this past week, the pictures and the video of the ramming and the water cannoning of BRP Datu Sanday, it brings it home in a way that a newspaper article might not, or a speech by President Marcos might not. When you actually see what's happening with that larger China Coast Guard ship, harassing and water cannoning the smaller BFAR vessel, it makes it clear that there really is a threat, and maybe we should, spend more resources on maritime security. Maybe we should pay attention to our national security much more than we would otherwise, because, again, it's just normal human nature that when you think of what you want out of your government, the first thing you think about is, as you say, your own neighborhood, your own family, right? You don't think, well, why should I buy more Coast Guard vessels when I have potholes in front of my house?
Yeah,
that's normal. That's not anything that doesn't make Filipinos somehow, more insular than other people in the world. It makes them human.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point to make. And we were talking about the ramming and the water cannons, but I think one of the more extreme cases was that of when the Chinese Coast Guard started bringing knives and axes, and that was a huge political moment. Like all Filipinos suddenly started ramming up. And to go back to what you said, the Philippines is prime location. So the Spanish knew that. They literally called us the gateway to Asia. Um, the Treaty of Paris, the Americans knew that. That's why they wanted the Philippine Islands at the time, and the Japanese knew that during World War II. So how about we dabble into your military mind? Because I want to know what a U.S. Air Force man thinks about. Do you think the approach of the Philippines has evolved enough, or are we still underestimating the Chinese Communist Party?
Oh, I think all of us are not paranoid enough, including Americans. I think that China's ambitions are no longer a secret. They, for a year or for decades, they had a policy of what they called hide and bide. Hide your capabilities, bide your time, waiting for the time when they could be strong enough to sort of come out and start sort of trying to actualize their ambitions. And now we're in that time, right? And so now understanding China's perspective, I think, is important. They look at the United States and they kind of think that we have an unfair advantage when it comes to our geography. So we have these two massive oceans on either side of us and two relatively friendly neighbors. And we don't really have geographical problems with security the way that they do. So they look around and they see problems everywhere. And of course, what they also see is American forces everywhere. They see, South Korea and Japan and, all of these. And of course, we have the Seventh Fleet and the South China Sea and other places. And so they look at us and they think, why don't we just stay on our own side of the world? We should just stay over there and we can divide the world up and they can have the East and we can have the West and then everything's fair. That's fair. Sort of oversimplifying, but that's, in some ways, that's the way they look at it. So then when we look at China's really vast ambitions, then we think, how can we, frankly, check those ambitions? Now, if I were still in diplomacy, I would not use the word containment because that's sort of like the word that they always use, sort of throw in our face. You're trying to contain China. And to be honest, we kind of are. I mean, really. I mean, we don't like to say it out loud, but when we think of what their ambitions are, to absorb Taiwan, to essentially turn East Asia into their own suzerainty, their own sphere of influence, where other powers are frozen out, and the other countries are treated as vassal states to China. We think that ambition is one that should be contained. They don't need to be, basically lording it over the most important part of the world in the 21st century. I think that. So then we look at the Philippines geography within that. The Philippines is part of what we refer to as the first island chain. And this is now everybody sort of talks about it now, but it's basically starts at the Korean Peninsula, goes down through Japan and Taiwan, and then through the Philippines and across maritime Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and then back up around Vietnam. And so that's a place to sort of check China's ambition. Or all of a sudden they begin to absorb all of that and they start to look further out to the second island chain and all of the, say going out all the way out to the Pacific Islands and Guam and other places. We don't think that. So, some people say, well, why don't you just let China have basically what it wants in the first island chain? Why don't we? Well, I mean, first of all, there are people in the first island chain. There are allies in the first island chain. There's the Philippines in the first island chain. We actually don't want them to have all of that. But the other thing is that when in human history has an aggressor state ever been satisfied getting what it says it wants first, and then said, okay, we'll stop now. That's not what happens. That was the kind of thing that was the conversation before World War II. Well, just let Hitler have the Sudetenland and let him, just all of Alsace-Lorraine. Just let him have that. Then they'll be satisfied. Obviously, that's not what happened. Eventually aggressor states, when they get what they want first, they become more aggressive because they get more confident and they think, well, if we can have this, why can't we have that?
Yeah, and that's an amazing point. And it's almost the same here with the Japanese. The Japanese were, after the Russo-Japanese War, they were like, hey, why not get China? Hey, why not get uh, Taiwan or Formosa at the time? So these ambitions start off really like, yeah, let's just give them that. But then you never know. They get more ambitious, as you said, with, Germany in World War II. So in terms of that, we know that China are, let's say it, there's no pretty word, they're kind of hypocrites when it comes to the law. They use laws that are good for them, but when that law is against them, they say, no, that law's not good at all. Something like UNCLOS or maybe the arbitral award. So China has used that misinformation to invade Philippine cyberspace for the last few years. We see it on Facebook, TikTok, maybe even Twitter. Who knows? So can we see a steady rise in the campaign to misalign Filipinos? And in your mind, what is the best way to combat it? Because we have areas where conversations like this happen, but they still have that capability to keep pouring in. Even with the Marcos administration having this transparency with the Coast Guard, they still keep pouring in.
Yeah. So I think a couple things. One is, I think that you can't put too much into trying to stop disinformation. And the reason is, first of all, the Philippines is a free society, and you want to keep that, right? Ultimately, you don't want your government to control information, because that's not the society you want to live in, right? You don't want to live in a society where there's one version, the government's version of the truth, because that's what an autocracy does. That's what China does, right?
Yeah.
That's not actually what we want. And so, I've always been a believer in that the best answer to bad speech is more good speech. So I think that's where things like transparency comes in, and just sort of getting the right information out there to combat the wrong information. Now, I do think honestly, the United States has a lot of the same problems. So we have, especially in 2025, we have a very fragmented media universe. So the people who are watching or who will watch SITREP Philippines are not the same people who are watching YouTube videos put out by parts of the media world that are more friendly to, say, the Chinese perspective. There are people who watch. So last night I was on One News. There are people who will never watch the mainstream media in the Philippines. They will only watch, say, what they get off of their TikTok channels or their YouTube channels or their Facebook pages. And first of all, it's normal, right? I mean, we all have confirmation bias. We all want to see the things that reaffirm our beliefs. That is a normal human reaction. It's one that we all should resist. And so, frankly, you and I, obviously we have strong opinions about the West Philippine Sea, but we should be out there looking at what the other side is saying. We should know what their arguments are. We should weigh them and see if any of them have merit. Sometimes we're not correct when we evaluate things. Sometimes we need, and even if we are correct, we need to understand what arguments the other side is making. So we all have to be very careful about disappearing into our media bubbles and only watching the things that we like. So when I'm a big fan of podcasts. I usually listen to them on audio when I'm doing something else. If I'm watching taking a walk or something, because that keeps my mind busy. But I try to listen to podcasts from a range of views, so that I understand what my favorite arguments sound like, but I also understand what the other arguments sound like, because one, it's important to know how to combat things that I think are wrong, but two, sometimes I'm wrong, and maybe I should listen to see if I am wrong. So, it's very hard to stop disinformation. Disinformation is, in a free society, is going to get out there. And by the way, the other thing about the term disinformation or misinformation is that one person's disinformation is another person's opinion, right? And again, sometimes the things that we label disinformation turns out to be true, right? So, for example, in the beginning of COVID, in the United States, a lot of people labeled the lab leak theory, the theory that COVID came from a lab in Wuhan. They
Yeah.
labeled that as disinformation. So all of the official information, all the people who curated the information for official Washington D.C. and other people would say, no, 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 no. We all know it came from a wet market. Well,
Oh, I remember.
today most people assume that it did come from a lab, and so so now we look back and we say, so what gave them the right to say the lab leak theory was disinformation? It was just inconvenient to somebody at the time. So we had to be very careful about how we label information. And we need to say, there's a difference between disinformation, something that is obviously false, and somebody's opinion.
And honestly, that's just great advice, because what if you just start listening to things that agree with your worldview, it just becomes an echo chamber. It becomes an echo chamber. You don't learn, you don't get to explore new things. But and in a society, having good conversation, whether you agree or disagree with a person, is a sign of a good democracy. It's just a sign of good faith in humans all around.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the time about so I have a podcast about the Indo-Pacific that I run with my friend Jim Caruso, and we're always looking, how can we get people who have divergent views onto the podcast, because we want to hear from all of them. And I think that's just a good policy for everybody who's in the media space.
So what's the podcast name? I might go and look at it right now and give you a subscribe or a follow.
We call it Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? And so of course it's meant to ask that very question. Our first question when we interview a guest is, why should we care about this? And we're trying to bring it down to the practical level. Why should people care? For example, I think our second ever podcast episode, all the way back over a year ago, was with Commodore Jay Terriella. And the question was, why should we care if China is harassing Philippine ships? And so from Jay's perspective, the answer is obvious, but we wanted him to explain to our much broader audience, our international audience, why should people care about this? And so, and then on the Indo-Pacific, because both Jim and I have spent most of our careers around the Indo-Pacific, the answer to why should we care about the Indo-Pacific seems very obvious to us, but we want people to care about the Indo-Pacific much more than they do now. And so that's how we try to draw people in. And it's been I would say it's exceeded our expectations as far as how successful. I am confident in saying that we are probably right now the world's leading regular podcast on the Indo-Pacific. Others that sort of come up in that discussion either don't put out much content or stopped putting out content. And we're approaching 80 episodes in just over a year. So we think we're doing pretty well.
Well, SITREP PH will try to be at least number 2, just right behind you. So
best of luck.
Thank you. So now we're talking about Indo-Pacific, but we've talked about the Philippines, we've talked about China, we've talked about Taiwan, but now let's get into ASEAN, the association, the region, and in my opinion, ASEAN, for better or worse, has done its job, but at the same time, its voting model, its consensus model. There was a saying by former Foreign Affairs Secretary Theodore Locsin Jr., it lasts because you can easily stop anything that is disagreeable, either by not showing up or just by saying no. I don't know if you think that's a good foundation for an organization or a democracy. I couldn't even imagine something like one senator saying no and the bill is already done. So ASEAN's consensus model is often cited by either the EU as its strength, but it's also its greatest weakness. Do you think this structure is still fit for purpose in the region, as volatile as Southeast Asia today?
I think it depends on what the purpose is. And so the argument that I have made, including on our podcast, in fact, we had one called Why Should We Care About ASEAN Centrality? But I think it depends on how much you expect of ASEAN. So there's another person we interviewed is a former Singaporean diplomat. His name is Bilahari Kausikan. And he's sort of very well known for his very practical approach to sort of international relations. And he had just a fantastic framing for understanding the limitations of ASEAN. And he's basically what he said was that people are trying to make ASEAN a horse when ASEAN is actually a cow, right? And so if you're trying to make ASEAN into a horse, you're going to be disappointed because it's not a horse. Now, a cow is a very useful animal, right? But if you're trying to make it a horse, it's going to be a very bad horse. So why not ask how you can make ASEAN a better cow rather than trying to make it into a horse? And what he was basically talking about there is, if you're trying to make ASEAN into a security organization like NATO or something like that, or, if you try to turn it into even, the US alliance structure or something like that, it's going to disappoint you because it's just not well suited to that. The interests of the individual countries are very different. Laos doesn't care about the West Philippine Sea. Why would Laos care about the West Philippine Sea? They're a landlocked nation, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And in the same way, the Philippines doesn't really care about the Mekong River because the Philippines doesn't. But if you're Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, these countries care a lot about the Mekong River. So there are big problems around the Mekong River, but nobody in the Philippines pays any attention to that because why should they? So, the kinds of things that ASEAN is called upon to try to solve are just very difficult for 10 countries spread out over a huge geographical area with vastly different populations. For example, I was in a conference in Kuala Lumpur recently, and it was all about the South China Sea. And so, okay, I thought, well, okay, we're all going to talk about the South China Sea. And when one of the Malaysian senior officials got up to give their introduction, he said, well, we all know that the number one security problem for us here in Southeast Asia is Gaza. And I thought, Gaza is a long way away. Why are we talking about Gaza? Well, in Malaysia, their population cares a lot about Gaza. Of course, it's a majority Muslim country. This is one of those things that just has a lot of resonance in Malaysia. But I mean, this was a conversation about the South China Sea. Why are we talking about Gaza? Well, it just shows you just how very, very different the interests of all of these countries are. I mean, even compared to Latin America, you have mostly every Catholic country. Everybody mostly came from a Spanish or Portuguese, colonial background. Those kinds of things are pretty similar. They're geographically, they're all pretty much close together. But even then, they have Venezuela is completely different than Argentina, and in their outlook on the world. So it's just really hard to take a geography and get everybody together on security problems unless you just have to find the most basic, non-controversial security problems and try to get together on those things.
Yeah. And actually, as we're talking about it, the dialogue on ASEAN maritime security is actually happening here in Manila. It's been happening for a few days now. And something that got my interest is that one of the speakers was talking about the code of conduct. Now, that's something the Philippines has been asking and begging ASEAN and even China, just please give us this one thing so that we can finally stop the ramming, the water cannoning, and all that. But while they were talking about the code of conduct, one of them suddenly asked, what if it goes against Philippine national interests or our sovereignty or what is in our EEZ? I forget her name, I apologize, but the undersecretary basically said, if it does that, we will not sign.
Yeah.
So it got me thinking. I mean, to a Filipino, it makes sense. I don't want to lose what we have, and it's in line with the administration. But at the same time, by us saying that, a lot of ASEANs are going to suddenly think that, hey, aren't you guys hypocrites? You're the guys who wanted the code of conduct. Why all of a sudden the sudden change?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really important point. So the code of conduct, to some degree, I feel like it's the same story every year. Did you ever see the movie Groundhog Day?
Yeah.
In the word, that then, the Bill Murray character, he wakes up every day in the exact same place, doing, with the exact same, basically reliving the same day over and over and over again. And to some degree, the code of conduct feels like that every year, right? You get a new ASEAN chair and somebody says, we're going to solve the code of conduct. The problem with that is that ultimately the interests are just too, they just clash way too much to lend itself to a solution. And I think that the point made there that you just referred to is the right one, which is the gold standard really for the kind of international rulings that have benefited the Philippines would be the arbitral ruling of 2016. Whatever you get out of a ASEAN-China code of conduct will not be as good as that, just in terms of what it says, right? Now, so the question is, what is the complaint that people have had about the 2000 DOC, the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, right? It set down some things that everybody thought would sort of keep everybody, basically maintain the status quo. Well, the problem was that the status quo was not maintained. China built huge artificial bases in the middle of the South China Sea. It began to harass its neighbors. All of those things happened after the DOC. And so people said, well, the problem with the DOC is it's not enforceable, or it's not, and so then the question is, who's going to be the enforcer? So what could you get China and all of the ASEAN nations to agree to as far as an enforcement mechanism? Well, if you look at what China's ambitions are, they are not going to accept any enforcer that is not basically China, right?
Yeah.
I mean, are they going to allow some supranational body, some transnational entity to stand in judgment of China's expansion in the South China Sea? They're not, right? Because their ambitions, their claims are not going to change, at least not in the near term. So I am a code of conduct pessimist. I don't think there will ever be a code of conduct, because I mean, if you're the Philippines, what code of conduct will China agree to that the Philippines will actually sign as being in the Philippine interest? I can't imagine it. I mean, getting China and the Philippines to be able to sign something, and again, it really comes down to the extent of China's ambitions and the and its claims. They're just right now, China is feeling very, very powerful, and they don't think they need to compromise those.
Yeah, that's a good point. And honestly, for the Philippines, it probably has to do something with the US. And once China sees that, whoop, red button, we're not going to cross that line.
So yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the most remarkable evolutions we've seen over these past 2 years is, while China has become much more aggressive in the West Philippine Sea, and you can say that they've made gains, right? They've consolidated their control over Scarborough Shoal. They sort of have control over Sabina Shoal now. But they have succeeded also in uniting their adversaries against them in an incredible way. I mean, you talk about all of these agreements the Philippines now has with Japan, and of course, the renewed commitment from the United States. You've got Australia. You've now talking to places like Germany. You've got help from Canada. You've got New Zealand has got a visiting forces agreement. I mean, this is really kind of incredible stuff. And I don't know that China went into these last couple of years thinking that's what it was going to create. So while looking out into the West Philippine Sea, we have a lot of things to be discouraged about. I think if we take a bigger step back and think about, in the end, the most important thing for the Philippines is to be able to defend itself and deter aggression against the Philippine archipelago. And I think the Philippines is actually much closer to that than they were a couple of years ago because of all of the work that it's done, making the world aware of the Philippines, of China's aggression, and then gaining international support. And it didn't come from ASEAN; it came from other like-minded countries whose help is actually really, really important.
Yeah, and to add to your point, when ASEAN nations like Indonesia, Malaysia, or Singapore started speaking in the ASEAN Maritime Conference on Security, what was China doing? Well, they were water cannoning and ramming another ship, this one by the DFAR ship. Yeah. So it sends a signal that, hey, you might have this conference, but we're still here. We're still roaming around. And it sends a signal to ASEAN as well. If you're going to do something about the Philippines, make sure you don't forget, we're right here too.
Yeah, I often, when I am in a conference, in fact, I did this last year during the Manila Dialogue in the South China Sea, I basically told everybody there, before you start lecturing the Philippines, you have to think about what it would be like if it was you, right? So right now it's the Philippines. In fact, later that year, when I was in Malaysia, I asked the Chinese diplomat who was on the first panel, I said, does China claim indisputable sovereignty over the 5 Spratly Islands occupied by Malaysia? And he didn't answer the question. And so I asked him again, and then I asked him a third time. And by the third time, the moderator was tired of me, and he shut me down and moved on. But I knew that later on I would be on a different panel, and so I had a chance to explain why I asked that question 3 times. And the answer is that, of course, they claim indisputable sovereignty over those islands. And the point I was trying to make to the Malaysians there, it's coming for you too. And if you are, wagging your finger at the Philippines and say, why are you causing trouble? Why can't you just get along with China? We're the smart ones down here in Malaysia. Oh yeah, well, remember that when China turns the eye of Sauron onto Malaysia, and it's your turn.
That's a good point. And honestly, China is just very aggressive with us since we have a VFA with America, we have the MPT, we have the long storied history of the Philippines and the US. The only reason why they're not so vocal with other nations is because that's
and your geography is actually kind of unfavorable for that, because you have within the Philippines EEZ, exclusive economic zone, you have a lot of features that are very close to the surface, and so you are the only country in the South China Sea basin that has a major Chinese base in the middle of your exclusive economic zone. That's mischief free, right? No other country has that. You are the only country that has had a major fishing ground taken away from you and probably destroyed by Chinese giant carp harvesting. So you have a history and a geography. It's not just the U.S. alliance, although that is a factor. You have a lot of other things that have led you to be the first to suffer under this expansionism.
Yeah, I can see that happening, and we don't know how soon China might have even more ambitions, maybe in the near future. But we're just hoping and praying that what the Philippines is doing is hopefully going to be enough.
Yeah, so I've spent a bit of time while I've been back here talking to the Philippine media, and in fact, I was on a couple of shows yesterday. And one of the points that I made yesterday on StoryCon, we were talking about what is it that the Philippines needs to do. Everybody always asks, what can we do, right? And I get it, and I think one of the things to keep in mind is this is a long struggle, and I have characterized, and this goes back to the Manila Dialogue in the South China Sea late last year, I have characterized China's South China Sea as being a maritime occupation. And so if you think of it like an occupation, what defeats an occupying force? If you are the resistance, what defeats an occupying force? The answer is time and patience and consistent struggle, right? Because ultimately, the reason occupying forces leave is because they get tired, they get worn out. They start to ask themselves, why are we wasting so many resources over things that we don't care about as much as we thought we did? So that's what makes an occupying force leave. And so that makes understanding that, I think, will help the Philippines to sort of plan out and realize things like capacity building, things like building up Philippine defense, things like increasing your international support. All of those things will be important to ultimate success. But if you think in the short term and you think, how do we get them out of Scarborough Shoal now? That's not happening, right? That's not about to happen. You have to think long term. You have to think resistance. You have to think, how do we defeat an occupation?
That's honestly a really good point that I never thought about before. Like when you hear a Filipino say, "Oh, we're gonna get back our territory," it kind of sounds like let's remove all these Chinese buildings, all these Chinese personnel. But at the same time, that's not really realistic unless we're gonna go all out war, which, God forbid, may never happen.
Right.
So that's not a really good point. I actually never thought about it that way. So as we go on, and now we're talking about defense, and when we talk about defense, only there are three letters that come up: the MTT, the Mutual Defense Treaty, that has been signed so long ago, even before I was born. So can you simplify what the MTT does? But
Yep.
of course, it's been done to death. But a lot of Filipinos still think that the NDT is just a piece of paper. Like, oh, America's not really gonna come, or it's just something that's gonna. It's like, what would you call it? It's a false narrative. It's something that we wave around so proudly, but maybe it's just a piece of paper.
Yeah. I don't know if you recall, but last summer we had 60 Minutes came out to, the big news weekly from the United States came out, and what was on a Philippine ship that went out towards Sabina Shoal and was rammed. And then I was interviewed for that episode, which was the premiere in the United States last year, and actually is going to rerun this summer. But one of the things that we talked about was this question of what is the Mutual Defense Treaty, and why does it matter, and what would happen if the United States didn't honor it.
Mhm.
So the first point I made when I talked to them was every treaty ultimately is a political document, right? If you don't honor an international treaty, there's nobody who's going to come and say we're going to fine you, right? There's no sheriff who can put you in jail. The penalty for not honoring treaties is that all your other treaty partners all of a sudden realize, open their eyes and say they're not good for their word. Our treaty, what's our treaty worth if that treaty was worth nothing, right? So the value, or the thing that binds us, is the rest of our treaty and alliance structure, which actually in the United States national defense interest is extremely important. If you read any of our national security documents, they all emphasize the importance of our treaty alliances. So in the Indo-Pacific, we have 5 treaty allies. Besides the Philippines, we have South Korea, Japan, Australia, and Thailand. Of those 4, Thailand's kind of the odd one because right now they've been sort of drifting toward China. But that the treaty alliance kind of keeps them on side a little bit, and they sort of, we're still doing, huge exercises with them. And so I think that, that's kind of the value of the treaty when it comes to Thailand. But if something were to happen where the U.S. failed to honor its treaty commitment to the Philippines, all of a sudden, what are Japan and South Korea and Australia, what are all these guys doing? They're looking around saying maybe we need to start hedging toward China too, because the U.S. isn't going to be there for us. So that's what keeps the U.S., I think, committed to the treaty. Now, of course, there are also things that the U.S. gets from the treaty. So the EDCA sites are important to the Philippines, but they're also important to the United States. In 2025, the U.S. is no longer making big bases like Clark and Subic used to be. I was actually stationed at Clark Air Base back when it was a big American base. We're not making those anymore. Because now the security problem is different. And so what we need is places where we have access, where we can pre-stage equipment so that if things do go bad, we can operate out of a lot of different places, so that China can't just target one place and take out everything. It has to think about, this is a very complicated security environment, and hopefully what that does is deter their aggression, deter them from saying, oh, because if there were only big US bases, they could say, okay, we'll target all of those on the first day and then we'll be done, right? Then they don't have anywhere to operate on, and we've chased them out of the first island chain. Well, if instead we have a lot of different places, not just in the Philippines, but across, Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Western Pacific, if we have a lot of different places to operate out of, now China has to think more about whether attacking is a good idea, because maybe they can't take us all out at the same time. Maybe they don't know where we're going to be. So that's part of the value that the US gets out of the alliance. So, I think it's always important to ask the question. If you're a sovereign nation, if you're the Philippines, you have to ask that question. You have to demand of the United States, how can we be sure of your commitment? And that's important for the Philippines to do. I don't think it's enough to say, well, trust them, they'll be fine. I think it's important to sort of, push that. But I think that we have done all of the things we're doing together now add to the commitment that the United States is making. And it's important to recognize that, even as you've seen all the news from Washington, D.C., with the U.S. cutting aid, with the U.S., trying to become maybe a little more isolationist in many ways, one place that's not happening has been the Philippines. All of the aid that was agreed to in the Biden administration is still coming. There are still discussions in Congress about, $2.5 billion in aid over 5 years. All of those things are still happening. Whereas maybe in other places in the world, people are saying maybe we need to bring that money back to the United States.
That's a great point, Mr. Powell. And as we wrap up, how about we end with it's a lighthearted question, but since we've been so serious for the past few minutes now.
Absolutely.
So the question I'd like to ask you is this: if you won and you became the 18th president of the Philippines, wow, add that to your title, which is unlikely, but maybe in some other world, yeah. Since you've dabbled into diplomacy and defense, I'd like to ask you, what in your first 100 days, if any government person is listening to us right now, what would you do in your first 100 days?
Oh, good heavens! First of all, I just wanted to say, of course, I'm constitutionally unable to be the president of the Philippines, and I would probably be a terrible one. I never wanted to be a politician. Look, I think that ultimately, so here's something I would do, and this may totally surprise you because it has very little to do with maybe what you would think of being a defense and security. But I would see if I couldn't rally the Congress to take a look at the constitutional provision that requires 60% Filipino ownership of businesses in the Philippines. I think that was put in after, of course, the Marcos regime. It was in the 1987 Constitution, but I think that has held back a lot of foreign capital that the Philippines really needs because ultimately what the Philippines needs is to become a stronger country, and becoming a stronger country is not simply a matter of having more ships and guns. It is a matter of having a strong economy. And while it's very tempting to say, well, all these big businesses should be owned by Filipinos, the problem with that is that keeps foreign capital out, right? So other countries are less willing to invest in the Philippines because they think they're going to have to sort of lose control of their businesses if they put them in the Philippines. So I don't think it's actually one of those things that's working well for the Philippines. Now, obviously, when you do have to worry about what foreign influence is in the Philippines, and you want to make sure you have rules and regulations that keep those foreign companies from having too much influence or acting as levers for foreign influence. We know that certain countries in your region might use that for nefarious purposes. But I think that what the Philippines really needs is an infusion of foreign capital so that it can advance into sort of, become once again an economic leader in the region. And that's what's going to give it the strength to be able to continue to build out its security forces, to build out its Coast Guard, to become a real power again in the region. So I don't think the Philippines wants to go back to the days when it was looked like it was either a U.S. colony or looked like a U.S. client state. Or you don't want those. You don't want that. You want to be strong, prosperous, and independent. And prosperous actually matters a lot in that calculus. And so I think actually any time there is something like that 60% rule, the people who benefit most from that are the big Philippine businesses, which are controlled by people who are very powerful and rich, and they don't want to have competition.
Story of our lives.
We all need competition. If you look back in the days, and I'm pointing at our own country too, by the way, I am not a big fan of some of these protectionist policies that the U.S. is putting in place. I look back, I was in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, U.S. auto manufacturing was in a rut. We made bad cars in the United States, and people didn't want to buy Ford and Chevrolet and Dodge and those cars because they weren't very good. And so what happened was we allowed in more competition, and Japanese and German cars came in, and people bought those instead. And that forced American companies to up their game and get better. And I think so. I think, bringing in foreign capital, bringing in foreign competition makes you better. And so, again, that may not be the answer you were expecting, but I would look actually at that 60-40 law and see if that couldn't be amended or at least worked around.
Well, as I said, if you were president, that's what you do. So before we end, Sir Powell, again, I'd like to say thank you very much. And for our listeners, if they would like to follow you or get updates on the West Philippine Sea, how about you talk about, for our last few minutes, your social media, your podcast, or maybe events you have in the future where they can spot?
Great. Thank you so much. So first of all, if you go to sealight.live, that's our website. That's where we put out a lot of our latest articles and things. That's where we put out a couple of really important ones, I think, for the Philippines on Scarborough Shoal just within the last month. Really some new research that we've done indicating the extent of Chinese control and the extent of damage that we believe they've done to Scarborough Shoal. So please go out there and check that out. On X, I'm at Gordian Knot Ray is my handle, because we're part of the, we came out of the Gordian Knot Center. So at Gordian Knot Ray. We do have a Facebook page called SEALIGHT. If you look for us on Facebook, you can see us there. I have to admit, I'm not quite as active on Facebook because it's there's so many different places in the world, and Philippines is much more of a Facebook country than America is. So I have to sort of meter that out. The podcast is Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? We have a YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/@IP podcast, Indo-Pacific podcast. So @IP podcast. So that's where we put out all of our Indo-Pacific comments. So if you like to watch it on YouTube, that's where you can find us. If you just like to listen to audio podcasts like me, you just go to your favorite podcast service, Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever, and you just download, or you just subscribe to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific. Just search for us. You'll find us. So we're pretty easy to find. Fortunately, we've got enough followers now so that it should pop right up. So, and I'm also on LinkedIn. If anyone is on LinkedIn, you can just look for my name. I put a lot of stuff out on there as well.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Powell. And for our listeners, you can also follow us on YouTube at SITREP and on X at SITREP. So thank you so much, Mr. Powell. I hope to meet you sometime in the future, hopefully face to face. I absolutely would love to talk to you. And may God bless you, sir. God bless the Philippines. And let's hope tomorrow the sun is still up. So thank you very much.
All right, Hans. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.